Welcome to Hochoka Podcast.
When Dr. Damian Costello thinks of the Lakota way, many sacred items come to mind. The Sundance tree, the čhaŋnúŋpa or sacred pipe, the drum, the prayer tie, and the Rosary. Hello, Mataki Api, and welcome to Hochoka, here at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School's campus. I'm Scott Wooster, today's Hochoka host. We're glad you've joined our circle to hear Dr. Damian Costello. He joins us to bring another fresh perspective on Catholicism through an indigenous lens. Today we turn to the most Catholic of prayers, the Rosary, understood as a Lakota way. Welcome, Damian.
Good to see you again, Scott.
Yeah, it's always good to have you here.
Thank you.
Good to have a discussion with you. We'll start with a parallel, a really beautiful parallel that you draw between the origin of the Rosary and the Lakota way. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. I don't know about you, Scott, but when I think of the most average American Catholic prayer, I think of the Rosary, right? I grew up saying the Rosary. It was in my very conventional Catholic background. But when I looked into where it came from, the story sort of jumped off the page to me. It goes back to St. Dominic, who lived in like the 1100s. And he was known as this fiery preacher, a very charismatic person. And he went to France to convert the Albigensians. And so he went there and he spent years preaching and he had no success. He was a failure. And so out of sort of dejection, despair, he decided to go on a retreat. And so where did he go? He went into the wilderness. And he spent 3 days on his own, fasting and praying. And so, you, a good student of Lakota way, what jumps out to you?
Amblecha. Yeah.
Amblecha, the vision quest, right?
Yep.
We know in the Lakota way that if you humble yourself before the spirits, you give up food, you give up water, and you cry. We know that tears are the most sincere form of prayer in Lakota way. That's what Dominic did. And just like in the Lakota way, the spirits heard him. We know in Lakota tradition that great gifts are given by the spirits to those people who humble themselves. And often ceremonies come out of that. The Sundance came out of a vision that was given to Kablaya, a story that Black Elk tells. So anyway, the Virgin Mary appeared to St. Dominic and said, "Here, I have a new prayer for you." And she gave him the Rosary. And with this prayer, you would bring many people to the good way. And so that's what happened with St. Dominic.
Okay. So I think it's fascinating that you've got that parallel drawn already. I mean, I'm drawn in. You said it jumped off the page at you, but just hearing that myself and knowing what is happening all over. It's summertime right now, and so all over Lakota country, Nakota country right now, there are people going into the wilderness, going up on hilltops and going in for their vision quests right now. And to have him do the same thing and to receive that vision is a really powerful thing. So you have St. Dominic who did this, was given the Rosary by the appearance of the Virgin Mary, correct, if I'm understanding? You've made an allusion to him as being something of an anonymous Lakota. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. One thing I grew up with was this idea, the anonymous Christian. So people started thinking in the 60s and 70s, before then, but really in the 60s and 70s, how do we understand non-Christians from a Christian perspective, right? We used to sort of by default think, well, if you don't accept Christ, then, you won't be saved. And we still hear that a lot. But we realize, no, we look around, people of goodwill who live beautiful, sacred lives. They're important, they're valuable, they're sacred. So how do we understand that? And so there was a theologian, Karl Rahner, who coined the phrase anonymous Christian.
Okay.
So that if you live a good way and you've never heard of the teachings of Christ, we can understand you as somebody who's living the way of Christ sort of anonymously. Now, that's a beautiful idea, but it is a bit paternalistic, right? It's only through the lens of Christianity that we fully validate you. And I look at the story of St. Dominic. if there's traditional Lakota elders who heard the story of St. Dominic, would maybe chuckle and could say, oh, that's St. Dominic, an anonymous Lakota man who through no fault of his own, never heard the stories, the teachings of White Buffalo woman,
Yep.
but still lived in a good and holy way, and the spirits visited him.
Right. So those connections are strong, no matter what you call them. Right. You've got the connections of going off into the wilderness. You're seeking something, and there's also that connection between the Rosary and prayer ties in the Lakota way. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Oh, sure. When I learned about prayer ties and practiced that, what a beautiful teaching that you take this sacred medicine and you put a little bit in this beautiful cloth and you put your prayer into it. You each intention you have, and you string that out. And when you're done, you have this long trail, this road of prayers that you have poured into this sacred herb, and that is an important part of ceremony, right? You can't have ceremony without that,
Right.
And that helped me to understand the idea behind the Rosary. Before that, to me, it was just sort of mindless words that were repeated over and over on this lifeless string of beads. But what should be happening is that you're putting your prayers into those beads in the same way. And the traditional way of understanding this is that each bead is a flower that makes a crown that you offer back to the Virgin Mary, who in turn brings your prayers to God, to the Creator. Right? So you are creating, again, this string of prayers of your deepest longings and offering that to the spirits.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. As a young guy, and you kind of said it already, but as a young guy, I saw the Rosary as kind of being mundane, banal. You just kind of, it's something that you do, and it almost takes that experience and a little bit of losing some of that youthfulness to kind of understand that. But as a guy who's made 500, 600 prayer ties at a time, and literally been surrounded by them, you can understand the power of those, and when you realize it, it's pretty life-changing.
That one thing I find so beautiful about Indigenous ways for, a person, non-Indigenous person, is how it brings to life things that I've missed about my own culture and background and spirituality, and lifts them up. One of the deficits I think I was working with, and maybe this is true for you, is like beads. They're just small, round little objects that don't really have any meaning.
Right.
But you step into a native context, and beads and beading are so culturally important, right? Lewis and Clark, who passed by here on the river, they said they could have gotten all the way from the beginning of their journey in the East Coast to the West Coast and back with just a small bag of blue beads, because they were so important to native peoples.
So valuable in trading.
So valuable.
Yeah. And you talk about Father de Smet, right? And our understanding Father de Smet and Sitting Bull and the nature of the beads, rosaries, as being part of the regalia and part of a learning tool for young Lakota men and women. Can you talk about that a little more?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Probably everybody's seen the picture of Sitting Bull, that proud, defiant warrior, sitting like a bull, quite literally, and around his neck is a rosary. And the story of that, there's so much to this. Father de Smet, traveling through the plains, he was requested by the Mountain Salish people in Montana to come, who had heard about the black robes from Mohawk trappers.
Okay.
And so after 4 journeys to St. Louis, Father de Smet finally responded, and so he was traveling all through the plains and the Rocky Mountains, and he would hand out rosaries, which the native people loved. He would run out consistently. Anyway, during the Great Sioux Wars, he took it upon himself to try to broker some sort of understanding between Lakota people and the U.S. government. So he went into Sitting Bull's camp unarmed, underwent ceremony, smoked the pipe, and talked to Sitting Bull for a number of days and gave him his own rosary. And Sitting Bull kept that. And that's what he wears around his neck in that photo. Now, there's some debate. Was that the actual one? We don't know. He might have given it away. But if he did, it shows that he went and got another one. This was an important part of his regalia.
Right. And it makes me wonder, and maybe you have insight on this, and maybe there's no way to know it at all, but you wonder the importance of that to Sitting Bull himself or to the people that De Smet encountered. Was it as regalia, or was it as a representation of a new way of prayer, or was it a representation of an old way of prayer? And I can idly speculate. Do you have a thought on that as you study?
Oh, lots of thoughts. And I think you're right to say we don't know necessarily exactly what Sitting Bull thought or any particular person, but it seems to be sort of a simultaneous spectrum of a lot of those ideas that a given person may adhere to some or all of those different perspectives. Did it represent something new? Yeah, it did. A new way of prayer that was added to an old way, not a replacement, but something that supplemented an incredibly beautiful, powerful way that was always the foundation of the Lakota people and remains so.
Yeah.
Was it regalia? Yes, also, right? It was this new piece of regalia that was symbolic of, walking in a new way, trying to make a new reality, a new difficult situation survivable, right? All new layers always added on to the old ones. Yeah. It's only the sort of very small-minded non-native people who come in and try to separate the two.
Yeah. And it seems like whatever else happened with that between De Smet and Sitting Bull, to me, here, and we know only what we know, but it seems like it was the best of what could have been imagined between a European Christian and Lakota way of connection at that point in history.
That's Scott. I really appreciate that perspective, because it's so hard to put ourselves back after this incredible weight of history, all the awful things that have happened, to go back to those initial moments and to see that those moments of possibility and connection that occurred despite the impediments. And so I think for many people, they feel the weight of history, they have a negative experience maybe with Catholicism, and it's difficult to see the rosary beads as something positive. But for Sitting Bull, that was the most authentic connection he had with a non-native person in that context. Here was a person who put themselves at great personal risk to try to connect with his people and do something better. And so I think part of him wearing that and keeping it as part of his regalia was a memory of that honorable and brave, courageous act that De Smet made.
Yeah. So I grew up Catholic, and I the rosary was sometimes public, right? Not very often. I look at, in my own mind, I have it as something that I might have caught my great-grandma doing, or a nun in the corner of the church, and wondered, geez, that doesn't seem like it's for me, that type of thing. Again, that's a kid's view of what that meant. But more often it's a private devotion, right? You'd think of rosary as being a very private prayer, which just as prayer ties are, it's such a sacred way of praying that it is a private devotion. How does the indigenous lens point us back to where it's a communal thing or a communal prayer?
Well, as you know, Lakota people and indigenous people in general are, communal people. Yes, you go off to do your vision quest. Yes, you might go hunting with you and just a couple people, but you do everything in community. And so the rosary was received that way and practiced that way in a lot of contexts. There's a great example of Dedication Day, where people would go to the cemetery to honor the dead, and they said the rosary together as they processed to the cemetery. It was a prayer for the sick where families would get together and pray for the sick, led by the catechist, who was often a former medicine person like Black Elk, Nicholas Black Elk. Mm-hmm. And it was something you did as a family before bed. So there was always this, it tied people together, just like Lakota ceremony and prayer does in so many different ways.
Right. I'm thinking if a young Lakota person came down off the hill with some insights from what they had gained on the hill, they would bring it back to the people. Mm-hmm. And you and I would think of the same thing. You would take it to Sundance, probably, where the people pray together. And as you're saying that people prayed with the Rosary for the greater good of the community, the word is Okeechobee, which mm-hmm. is for the people, right? Or, it's done for the people. So you bring the prayers back from the hill, not for yourself, but you bring them back for the people.
That they may live, right?
That they may live,
That beautiful Lakota prayer that imbues the Sundance and everything in the Lakota way.
Yeah.
There's this one story that an old Jesuit told me in Pine Ridge that sort of captures, the living character of the Rosary, at least as it used to be in previous generations. Pete Ketches, who I'm sure you're familiar mm-hmm. with, he was a really important leader in bringing back the Sundance and bringing back Lakota ways into the public and revitalizing them after decades of extreme persecution mm-hmm. by the U.S. government and churches. He went to a funeral it was a wake in Calico, which is near where Red Cloud Indian School is today. And so he went into the church, and everybody was silently praying. He said, "Anybody can say the Rosary?" Now, Pete Ketches had been a catechist, Catholic catechist, before he went back to his traditional ways.
Okay.
And but the Rosary remained an important prayer for him. And so when people said, "Oh yeah, we should do that," he led the Rosary. Mm-hmm. And this is a traditional Sundance intercessor and medicine person,
right, doing
so.
And the more you delve into it, the more it seems you find that the great Lakota leaders like Pete Ketches or mm-hmm. Black Elk were found a way to incorporate the best of everything, right? And again, we come back to possibility.
Possibility, right? The best of everything, Scott. That's such a beautiful way to end this. And I think of the most poignant image that I know of the Rosary is Nicholas Black Elk, who he was known for saying the Rosary with one of his elder friends on the way to going to church. And so they would say the Rosary together. And, there's this Lakota elder who remembered that he would not talk about distance in terms of miles or time, but the number of rosaries it would take to get mm-hmm. to where they were going.
Yeah.
And I think of him and his friend saying the Rosary as they walked, and that beautiful image from the Sacred Pipe where he says, "Let each step that you take on Mother Earth be a prayer." Mm-hmm. And so that full body spirituality that I think so many of us are yearning for, of the Rosary in one hand, and he wasn't carrying a pipe at that time, but mm-hmm. living the Lakota way fully mm-hmm. and saying his prayers with each step. Right. Prayer literally becoming prayer as he walked Mother Earth. And that's what I strive for when I think about these various ways.
Absolutely. Mm. Absolutely. And I think that is extremely powerful, and it is a good guide for the way that we desire to live, or the way that we should desire to live, to walk in that good path, to walk that čhaŋnúŋpa, or the good red road. So thank you for sharing all of that with us today. I appreciate that, and I've certainly learned. I'm learning some things to correct my childhood, my perceptions at that point. So that was very helpful, and this is good history that needs to be taught. So thank you very much.
Can't wait to talk some more.
Let's do it. Appreciate having you here, Damian. And we appreciate our audience once again for joining us here in Ho-Chokeh at the center of St. Joseph's Indian Schools campus, where we talk about issues central to Native America today. Until next time, stay centered.